After a relatively quiet day one of the NFL legal tampering period, the Denver Broncos made a late splash on Monday evening, potentially finding the replacement for Shelby Harris, agreeing to terms on a deal with the San Francisco 49ers impactful defensive lineman. Plus, will Melvin Gordon return to the Denver Broncos? Right now, it seems a little bit unlikely, but we talk about what that looks like for the organization. Plus, what are the latest rumblings on the Broncos rumor mill for free agency? You get that and much more in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked on NFL Network, your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. Both of us, we cover the Denver Broncos for the Locked on Network and 9 News. The Broncos had a relatively quiet day on Monday, but Monday evening, they made their first domino move of the NFL free agency period, agreeing to terms with the defensive lineman who could impact the Broncos defense in 2022. Thank you for making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day. Broncos country, you can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format. You can get us here on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. Sayre, my friend, hey, look, we had just previously sat down to record an episode of the show. We had it all planned out, and, it was really on the premise of the Broncos had a quiet free agency, and then, of course, late in the evening, bam, the Broncos make a move. And we tried to record later to avoid that, but it still got us, my friend. Obviously, the Broncos getting an impactful defensive lineman in terms of the eyes of the organization.
They did. DJ Jones coming over from the San Francisco 49ers. So the Broncos, the first two really big moves of the offseason, dipping into the NFC West a little bit. I dig it. I'm here for it. And we talked about DJ Jones a couple of times on this podcast, right? So listeners of the show, they know. I mean, DJ Jones over the last couple of seasons, 17 tackles for loss between 2020 and 2021 for the San Francisco 49ers, 5 sacks, which is a lower number, but at the same time, this guy's known for his run-stopping abilities. So we get a chance to watch more of him. We'll have more information on him, but at the same time, I think right now we know, based on what people have been saying about him, based on just kind of early and quick scouting reports on free agency, it seems like DJ Jones is going to be a really good replacement at that starting defensive end spot opposite of obviously Draymond Jones on this Broncos D-line now, and he's a younger option as well. So he almost got an identical contract to Cody, 3 years, $30 million with $20 million guaranteed.
Well, and I think for the Broncos, too, I think people are wondering, well, is this going to be a move that the Broncos make to get pressure on the quarterback? To my understanding, this is a move solely based on the Broncos stopping the run because according to Benjamin Albright, the Broncos plan to play a little bit more nickel and dime this upcoming season, which means that you need your defensive linemen to really be anchors there. So really the pass rush for the Broncos, for the interior defensive linemen will be predicated based on stunts. Like we'll see some twists, some different combination type stunts there, linebacker blitzes from the inside guys, and obviously your pass rush pressure from the edge rushers. That's going to be the Broncos' main predication here on pressure here. So DJ Jones is really an anchor against the run. As you mentioned, the last 2 years, Sayre, 17 tackles for a loss behind the line of scrimmage. Now, we talked about the loss of Shelby Harris being big, but for the Broncos going out and getting DJ Jones, this is a very solid move. Now, I think in the eyes of some Broncos fans, they may be like, well, he only had 5 sacks. As you mentioned, that's not as important right now because he's a true run stuffer here, which is what the Broncos need. And if Mike Purcell can stay healthy and you can factor in a healthy DJ Jones here, the Broncos might be really good against stopping the run. We'll see what they do at inside linebacker and also at edge rusher. That's their next priority here in free agency. Nothing yet in terms of that front here for the Broncos, but it definitely makes the optics a little bit more appealing. Plus, the Broncos will be playing the 49ers next year, in the regular season. So they will get a little bit of, inside help there from DJ Jones on maybe what to expect a little bit from Trey Lance, who obviously will be a, real true rookie in terms of play status in the NFL entering his second season. So, to be honest with you, I actually kind of like this move. I think this is a very solid move. The Broncos didn't have to go out here on day one and break the bank. I know we had talked about in our previous episode we had recorded about, hey, it's a good thing that the Broncos didn't go out here on day one where everybody else, every team in the NFL free agency period on day one illegal tampering period, they went out and they spent buku bucks. The Broncos didn't have to do that. And I think that's a smart decision because I think everyone wants the Broncos to be the one to make the loudest kind of splash in the room, the big splash here. But obviously, I think there's a saying, and I'll say it here again, Sarah, it's super important to me. He who laughs last laughs loudest. So you don't have to be the guy that laughs first, but as long as you're the guy that laughs last, you will be the loudest laugh in the room. And I think that's the most important part here. George Paton calculated as well, identifying a need, because we talked about it. Defensive line is one of those pressing needs here.
It is. It is. And this really opens up the rest of free agency, right? To be able to say, all right, now we can go and attack other positions where we need starters right away. The defensive end position, replacing Shelby Harris, was obviously a top priority for the Denver Broncos. And rightfully so. I mean, Shelby Harris was a key starter on that defensive line, but now you just kind of replace him. And like you said, I mean, these defensive linemen, they're going to be asked to do a bit more anchoring this year. These edge guys that are coming in, the responsibility on them is going to be huge. And you're absolutely right regarding this free agency philosophy. You know, we saw the Los Angeles Chargers go out and make a ton of moves on day one, including getting J.C. Jackson. But the J.C. Jackson luster will wear off as soon as the Denver Broncos sign whatever pass rusher they're going to sign, because then everybody's going to be like, oh, you know, everybody turns from one shiny thing to the next shiny thing. And they're like, oh my gosh, look at the Broncos got X, Y, or Z. And we don't know who that's going to be at this point, but we do know without a first-round pick, without a top 50 second-round pick, I firmly believe, Cody, the Broncos are going to make a huge splash off the edge. I think pretty much everybody expects that. And they're kind of surprisingly maybe in the cornerback market as well. So, yes, free agency day one may have been a little bit quiet. No big splash on day one until the DJ Jones move. But now let's see what happens on day two. Let's see how George Paton continues to work. He's putting feelers out there, obviously. I think every general manager in the NFL is, and he's getting kind of his ducks all in a row, seeing if plan A, whatever his plan A looks like, is going to be able to come to pass. And so that gets me excited, even if we haven't seen the moves happen just yet.
Will the Broncos be a little bit more active today on day two of the NFL legal tampering period? Will Broncos country continue to drink that cup of coffee you have here on this beautiful morning here, Lockdown Broncos? But coming up here in just a moment, we're going to dive into a little bit of a conversation. There was mutual interest between the Broncos and Melvin Gordon potentially reuniting. However, that's taken a little bit of wind out of the sails, and it looks like it may not happen now. What do the Broncos do at running back? Sayre, Bedinger, myself, we get into that conversation coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about BetOnline.net, the sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. And it's that time of year again as college basketball's tournament is finally upon us with March Madness. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, BetOnline.net is the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. And BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and information this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sport, wagering, information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. As we jump into the second half action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, once again, a major shout out to everybody in Broncos country. Thank you for making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, 5 days a week, all year long. Both Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we have you covered with all the Denver Broncos news, content, and information and analysis that you need all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an offseason. Sayre, kind of continuing our discussion here today, we were talking about Melvin Gordon a couple weeks ago about, hey, are the Broncos going to bring him back? There was reported mutual interest by Melvin Gordon's camp and by the Denver Broncos camp in bringing Melvin Gordon back. However, it's now seeming unlikely that Melvin Gordon will return to Denver, as reported by our good friend Benjamin Albright, great friend of the show. We're going to have him on the show here in the near future. Outside of that, I'm not kind of surprised, because here's some of the terms I believe that maybe makes this decision, I think, easier for the Broncos. Melvin Gordon wants to be the primary guy, sir. He wants to be the number one guy, which I certainly do not understand in this offense, as we see in the NFL today, why it's all about I should be the running back one. I should be the first guy. When we look at both Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon last year, you know how many touches they had combined? 203 equally. So each had 203 total touches last season. That is very balanced, which I feel like in today's NFL, I think you need to have that.
I think you do too. And frankly, you saying that makes me believe that Pat Shurmur at least did one thing right, giving them a pretty even split there. I mean, even if some games were leaning heavily towards the other, at least over the course of the season, it ended up being pretty even. And absolutely, I mean, it really doesn't matter the distinction between running back one and running back two at this point. If you have a hot hand, a coaching staff is not going to take you off the field. I mean, it's not like they're going to force feed one guy if they deliberately sign two guys that have running back one capabilities. So there's obvious strategy there. And with a 17-game regular season, even when it was only 16 games, Cody, I think we'd all agree, man, you need to have multiple backs. I would argue you need to have 3 or 4 guys that could carry the load for you. And Broncos fans have unfortunately discovered that in the hard way through the years. So I would say for Melvin Gordon, if you're looking for a running back one job, one of them just went off the table on the first day of free agency as the Miami Dolphins signed Chase Edmonds from the Arizona Cardinals. So those spots are going to fill up, and I think that obviously he'll get a contract somewhere, but it's one of those things where would you like to see him stay? Sure. I mean, if he's willing to be that guy with Javonte Williams, not necessarily behind, but with. But if he's not, I'd say let him go and see if he can get an offer elsewhere.
Well, and I know that some of the narratives has been kind of painted about Melvin Gordon, which look, I think that Melvin Gordon, his time in Denver, I think he's been very valuable to them on the offensive side of the ball. There's been some narratives coming out though about Melvin Gordon that he's all about making money. It's really about financials for him. It's all about his production and stuff like that. In terms, he's got the perception he's not a great teammate in a sense for other guys. And I think that look, I understand it comes with the territory when you're a starter in the NFL, and obviously he was for many years for the Los Angeles Chargers. But it's like you have to evolve with the NFL. The game is evolving. It doesn't really matter if you're the starter as long as you're going to get your touches. Shouldn't that matter at the end of the day? That's a question that I kind of throw out there. But then again, I'm not in Melvin's position. So it's hard for me to sit up here and say or give my opinion as to what I think Melvin should or shouldn't do. Because, hey, at the end of the day, look, these guys have to have confidence in themselves. And look, I certainly understand that. But now it appears very unlikely Melvin will return in Denver. So, Sayre, my next question to you, Javonte Williams now running back one here for this organization. I don't believe that Javonte needs to be a guy that gets 27 touches a game in terms of carries. I don't think that's sustainable for a long 17-game regular season schedule. I think you have to have the same approach you did last year. You have to have balance with your rushers. I think you have two running backs who you give equal carries to. Obviously, Javonte's a little bit of a bruiser, but now I think you can really add in a flashback now. Could that be Mike Boone, or do you think that the Broncos look elsewhere? Because I did see a tweet you put out there. You said, hey, I have a prediction. I don't believe that Mike Boone will be on the active roster in 2022. So what do the Broncos do at RB2 here, Sayre?
Well, I think they got to do something, right? I don't know that it's necessarily going to be free agency, but I love this year's NFL draft class. And, somebody
Deep.
pointed out to me, it's deep. Yeah, absolutely. A deep class. And somebody did point out to me, I think it's a good point to bring up too, that Mike Boone, obviously, George Payton signed him last offseason. And now Clint Kubiak, who was part of the coaching staff in Minnesota, could potentially vouch for him as well. So I might be backed up against the wall on that prediction, but I think just from the depth of the free agency class, the depth of the draft class, to me, you're going to be able to go out and get, I don't know, however many backs you want to get and say, this guy could actually play for us. And you brought it up, Javonte Williams' play style, he's a bruiser. You can't have that kind of a guy carrying the ball 27, 32, however many times a game. You just can't do it.
How'd that work for Ezekiel Elliott?
How did it work for Ezekiel Elliott? Even over the course of time, how did it end up working out for Derrick Henry? I mean, you could point to any number of guys. The bell cow back in the NFL, it simply cannot exist anymore, in my opinion. I mean, some fantasy football managers might be upset about that, but I don't think Javonte Williams or anybody in the NFL should be a bell cow running back. Maybe he's your running back one. So running back two, like you said, do you go out and get somebody that's got some flash to their game? Do you go out and get, I love that I talked about on Twitter on day one of free agency, J.D. McKissick, who I had on my fantasy team last year, constantly putting up double digits. Because why? Because the dude can catch the ball out of the backfield.
Yeah.
I think you've got to get somebody that has 3-down versatility, somebody who's maybe stylistically a little bit different from Javonte Williams. And there are a lot of players out there, Cody, that can do that.
Well, George Payton got to watch McKissick up close and personal when the Washington Commanders played the Denver Broncos. Weird calling them the Commanders now. I was thinking the WFT, the Washington football team. But no, I like the J.D. McKissick op. And I mean, he and Javonte Williams, I mean, ideally on paper, right? And I think everything that we do with free agency, it's all paper projections here. We got to wait till the on-field product actually happens, but it's great to see like, hey, how could this guy be plugged in and maybe have a role within this offense? I think when you expand on the weapons that the Broncos now have, I mean, especially a quarterback there, Sayre, I can't overstate that enough. I think anything opens up here. And, even this too, I think that there's been some talk. I know our good friend Mario Vitanzi, who's like, how come you and Sayre haven't had me on the pod? It's like our schedules don't sync up, Mario, you filthy casual. But outside of that, he did say that Philip Lindsay would love to return to the Denver Broncos. And this is the type of scheme where we really saw Phil excel and explode a little bit. So, I mean, I'm not opposed to it as well, but it's also at the same point, he's probably not going to be the primary guy. But I also think for George Payton, I think that ship has kind of sailed a little bit for this Broncos team. But then again, we'll have to see what free agency brings here for this Broncos football team. But what are some of the rumor mills saying about what the Denver Broncos may do here in free agency? A lot of steam on day one around the NFL pertaining to maybe what the Broncos could do do. We talk about moves we agree with, we would disagree with if in fact they happen, coming up here in just a moment. But let me tell you about rockauto.com, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. And rockauto.com, if you need anything for your vehicle, rockauto.com has everything for your vehicle. And you can save time and money when you choose rockauto.com here today. Why should you choose to spend 20%, 30%, 50%, or 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a local car dealership when you can get them at a cheaper and reliable price at rockauto.com? Rockauto.com is a family-owned business that's been serving auto parts customers online for over 20 years, and Rock Auto prices are always reliably low, whether you're a professional or a do-it-yourselfer. And they have everything you could be looking for, whether it's brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, or even new carpet for your vehicle. rockauto.com has everything, and their website is easy to navigate and easy to use. You can find all the parts available for your car, truck based on year, make, model. You get to choose the brands, the specifications, and even the prices that you prefer at rockauto.com. So go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car, truck, right? Locked On there. How did you hear about us box? So that they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, looking at the Broncos rumor mill here in terms of where the team has interest. Sayre, some interesting dynamics here on day one around the NFL pertaining to the Denver Broncos. Now, I think we can talk about maybe one that's exciting, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm just basing this based off how I feel here. One of the first rumors that we did see out there is that Russell Wilson is attempting to lure Bobby Wagner over to Denver to play with them this season. Obviously, that's what the Russell Wilson factor does. Does this make sense for the Denver Broncos? I see that there are a lot of members, some other podcasters, some other blog members, writers out there, and also just fans are like, I don't know about Bobby Wagner, which I can see the arguments for, right? Especially if you have to spend big time money on him. But then again, it's like you compliment a guy like that, Bobby Wagner, as the true Mike backer with a Baron Browning and being able to rotate guys like Jonas Griffith. I mean, it's kind of hard not to hey, that's kind of exciting.
It's very, very exciting, and for way more reasons than just you insert Bobby Wagner into the defensive depth chart, and all of a sudden your defense gets exponentially better, but the cap takes a big hit. Well, what is it worth to us, really, Cody, to see Baron Browning get the opportunity and Jonas Griffith get the opportunity to work with Bobby Wagner at the linebacker position? To me, there's so much more value in moves like this. What did we see happen when the Broncos signed DeMarcus Ware back in 2014? We saw Von Miller absolutely take off. Because why? Because you brought in somebody that was able to help set Von Miller on the right path, that was able to show him different work habits, that was able to show him this is what it takes to be a Hall of Famer. You have Hall of Fame talent. I'm going to show you what it takes to be a Hall of Famer. How could you not want somebody that could do that now for your current linebackers or any defensive players in general? Somebody who has been to the mountain and back and could show your guys how to do that. I just feel like there's so much more value to a guy like Bobby Wagner than just, he's going to look good in a Broncos uniform and all that stuff. But man, I think it goes way beyond just with intangibles, with the things that he can do helping develop the other players on the roster. And not to mention, I think he continues to solidify you are a contending team.
Well, not to mention, he had 172 tackles last season, Sayre. I mean, he was all over the place for that Seattle Seahawks defense. Unfortunately, the rest of the defense was really struggling. I mean, they paid a lot of money to Jamal Adams. You had some young guys banged up in the secondary at cornerback. Outside of that, the defense did struggle, but Bobby Wagner is still a solidified part of that defense. He was a really a bright spot for them, even though that the defensive unit struggled. And obviously, they've overhauled the entire defense, the whole entire staff. They've added new talent, new personnel there, and obviously they're going through a lot of changes. Now they're adding Shelby Harris to the mix, which, we got all the love for Shelby Harris and hope for the best for him. We're going to support him anytime we get a chance to watch him. But outside of that, it's not the other rumor. Now there was a rumor that was really heating up yesterday that the Denver Broncos do have interest in Dallas Cowboys set to be unrestricted free agent pass rusher Randy Gregory. Now I know you and I have talked about that here on the show. For me personally, Sayre, and I don't want to speak for Broncos country, I'm just going to speak for me. And if you feel the same way, you disagree, let me know, challenge me on it. But I don't feel excited for the Broncos if this is the move that they make at edge rusher. I would actually be very, very disappointed because here's the reason why. Outside of the fact that we talked about, yes, he had 4 penalties, I think, really critical penalties that were accepted against him last year. personal fouls, roughing the passer, just some boneheaded plays, especially late in games that really impacted the Dallas Cowboys defensively in key situations. That doesn't sound like what the Denver Broncos have on defense. There was a much more disciplined defense there in Denver, and I think that if you add Randy Gregory to the mix, you might compromise that a little bit. Yes, his pass rush win rate that he had in terms of as a pass rusher, that's great and all. I understand the Broncos have to get more pressure, but is he a good fit for the team? Not to mention the other things too. He's played in 50 games, Sayre, in his career. He's only started in 12 games in the National Football League. That, to me, I think is a little concerning. I would honestly, the Broncos look elsewhere in NFL free agency, a pass rusher here. I would not be excited about Randy Gregory. That's just my opinion. Do you agree? Do you disagree?
If he's the number one guy that they're trying to target off the edge, Cody, that would greatly disappoint me. I mean, not to say that, again, like you said, pass rush win rate, that's great. You watch the tape, you turn on the tape of some of the things that he can do as a pass rusher. I mean, he's talented. There's no question about it. I don't think that's ever been an issue for Randy Gregory. Remember back in the day, I mean, he was projected as like a top 5 draft pick by a lot of the experts, and there were good reasons for that. And he's shown that when he's been able to stay on the field. However, the fact that you brought up, he's played 50 games. It feels like he's been in the league for like over half a decade for sure at this point. Feels like he's been in the league for a really long time and just hasn't been able to get out onto the field for one reason or another, whether that's being suspended or being injured. And that kind of a thing, like let's just put this out on paper for a second here, right? Bradley Chubb has been oft injured the last few seasons, hasn't he? And because of that, you already have an injury risk in Bradley Chubb as your primary edge guy right now. Then if you add somebody like Randy Gregory, who's going to be 29 this season and has a history of suspensions and, doesn't always stay healthy either, what are you really doing at the edge position? So if they were to go out and get Chandler Jones and Randy Gregory, I'd be thrilled by that. That's great.
Yes.
That's a different conversation completely. But if you go out and get Randy Gregory and then say, well, we're just going to we're going to re-sign Malik Reed, we're going to see what Jonathan Cooper's got, that to me, it would not be a good move, and it just doesn't seem like what George Paton's, brand or flavor is at this point.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you there too. And as we talked about, it was kind of interesting because we know that things aren't leaking out of George Paton's office in terms of that. So my biggest thing, I imagine this has a lot to do with the agent-driven agenda in terms to boost the price of their client, which I certainly understand. That's exactly what your agent is supposed to do here. But it just would not push the needle for me, considering especially what we're seeing for some other teams around the NFL, especially in the AFC West, some of the moves that they're making on the defensive side of the ball. The Broncos still have to find a way to get pressure on Justin Herbert, Derek Carr, Patrick Mahomes. And look, while I understand that's going to be the case, Randy Gregory has never finished an NFL season in his career. That, to me, I think is a little concerning, never playing a full season so far throughout his tenure in the NFL. So Broncos country, do you agree? Do you disagree? Should the Broncos go after Randy Gregory? What are your thoughts on the Broncos after day 1 of NFL free agency? Could they be active today here in day 2? We'll stay on standby because in case something does happen, Sayre Bedinger and myself, we have you covered with an emergency podcast if the Broncos make a big splash in day 2 of the NFL legal tampering period. With that said, I'm Cody Roark, host of Lockdown Broncos, shouting out my good friend here, Sayre Bedinger, co-host of the show. We'll see you tomorrow for a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.